All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this live webinar. I hope you're all keeping safe, and I hope you're all doing well, staying positive. I know that times are definitely not the best right now, but I'm sure that things are going to get better a lot soon as long as we all stay home and stop the spread of COVID-19. We're going to be coming out of this very soon, and it's of course good to make use of the time that we have now to learn all sorts of skills and do all sorts of things that we might not have had the opportunity to do if we weren't staying home and having this extra time. So we're all in this together and we're going to get out of it really, really soon. Before we begin today, I do want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Tanmay and my passion is to explore technology. I love researching and developing with all sorts of next generation technologies, from artificial intelligence, machine learning, to all sorts of new next gen tech. But it's not just applying this technology in fields like healthcare and education where it can really make an impact that fascinates me. It's also taking this technology and making it accessible to others, enabling others to work with it as well. Through, for example, media like my YouTube channel, the books I author, the keynotes that I have, the workshops that I do, all sorts of different media working towards this goal of mine of getting more and more people to work with technology. And as a matter of fact, today's webinar is the perfect example of one of these media through which I love to share what I learn and what others learn as well. This is actually the very first episode of Tech Life Skills with Tanmay, a brand new webinar series that I'm launching, and the entire goal here is to take inspirational leaders from the world of technology and enable them to really share their years of experience and wisdom with all of us and allow us to learn from them as sort of role models in the field of technology. And so, without any further ado, I do want to introduce my very first, very special guest. His name is Dave Mookerjee. He is the CTO of Red Hat Synergy Asia Pacific. He's really passionate about what he does. He is an expert in all sorts of emerging technologies, from advanced analytics to artificial intelligence and cloud computing and open source and so much more. Now, I do want to get into this discussion with Dave that we're going to have today. I'm sure it's going to be really insightful for a lot of us. But before we get into that, I do want to say that Dave is very, very passionate about the work that he does. He absolutely loves working with these technologies, and really, not just is he an expert in emerging tech, he's also responsible for advising and helping different business leaders and decision makers, and enabling them to understand this technology so they know what to do with it. Where should they invest with this technology? When should they be doing it? Enabling them to make better decisions. And he's so passionate about this work. And you're probably wondering, well, how do I know that he's so passionate about the work that he does? Well, I mean, I initially met him around 3 years ago in New Zealand. So I was in New Zealand for the Watson Summit in Auckland. And while I was there, I met Dave at the event. It was a great experience. But then from there, what happened was, while I haven't worked with him directly, when I reached out to him to if he would be a special guest on the webinar, then he said yes. And guess what? He is from Sydney, Australia, and while it's 11 a.m. Eastern Time, so here in Toronto where I am, it's currently around 1 a.m. for him. So he's doing this just for us, to share his insight with us. And so a huge thank you to him for staying up till 1 in the morning to really help the audience gain some insight from his wisdom. And so, without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dave. Hi, Dave. How are you? Do you want to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you do and what you've been working on?
Hey, Tanmay, thank you so much for having me on. And thank you for those kind words of introduction. Seriously. Yes, we did meet 3 years ago, and it's a pleasure to, see you, grow from pillar to pillar over the last few years. Thanks for having me on. Look, to whoever has joined you, welcome to my home. Pleasure to have this conversation, and hope all of you are staying safe wherever you are. I'm assuming in your homes too, given the current situation. So, quick introduction. My name is Dave Mookerjee. I am, as Tanmay said, the CTO for the Red Hat Synergy office in Asia Pacific. I am based in Sydney. And I do cover a broad breadth of technology, as Tanmay mentioned. Before my current role, I was the CTO for Watson Solutions in Asia Pacific. Um, and I joined Watson in, I think, 2013, late 2013. So I've kind of gone from when I used to talk about AI in 2013, 14, people would, just look at me funny as to, what am I talking about? And here we have, people, you can't poke a website, a stick at a website which doesn't talk about AI or cloud computing. So it's been a fascinating journey. That's me.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for introducing yourself, Dave. And I want to jump right into a discussion. Remember, this is a collaborative discussion. If you have any questions for me, I'd love to answer them. I can answer any questions that you may have. But I want to start off with something that's really been on my mind, and it's that we've seen all sorts of emerging technologies, and of course, you're an expert in a broad sort of variety of these technologies. So we've seen like machine learning technology, we've seen cloud and blockchain and IoT, and just so much. And of all of these technologies, I want to get your opinion as an expert. So, from a scientific perspective, first of all, and then from a society perspective, what are your favorite technologies to work with, or just favorite technologies in general? So, first of all, from a scientific and technological sort of facet, and then finally, how that technology is actually impacting people, impacting human society. And then, if you could also touch upon some use cases for that technology, that would be great.
Given the job that I do, given my core skill, which is working with organizations, helping them understand emerging tech, those two are not very separate for me.
Mm-hmm.
From a scientific approach, and what impact that's having on society. Given that I am in IBM, and I've pretty much worked with large enterprises. So look, to answer your first question, I think, given what I've been doing for the last decade and a half, um, the sheer volume of data that's been created globally, and the fact that data driven decision making is, you know core to everything that we do nowadays, at a business level, at an individual level. I mean, I wear a Fitbit. I track my sleep patterns on a daily basis. This is where the core of information lies, and taking that prior experience of advanced analytics through to machine learning, then deep learning, and the broader AI umbrella, is probably the passion that I've developed for the last almost 2 decades now. Um, but that's not so far away. I think what's the difference between the scientific side and the societal side is probably just a lagging discussion,
Yeah.
where what you're discovering today, what you're putting in place today, what you're researching today, eventually will come into a societal impact. Maybe not exactly as you think it will, but it will. And I think being part of that journey for an organization, for a bank, for a retailer, for a transportation company, who is looking at, how do I even take this thing which I understand at a high level, how do I put that into an investment? How do I build a team around that? How do I, put skills around that? How will that impact my customers? What is the regulatory impact of that?
Mm-hmm.
That's really exciting, and that's where I spend most of my time. So, I would say AI probably is the first answer, but the downstream answer is actually quite a few different ones. I think cloud computing, completely has changed the spectrum at a societal level. You have startups, you have uni kids, you have school going kids who are starting their own businesses because technology is so easy to access on the cloud today.
Yeah.
So I do think those two are big items. I do want to think that there's something else that's happening right now. If you asked me this question in November last year, that's where I would have stopped as the two biggest items. I do think, given the change that the world is going through right now, there will be new ways, technology will impact us. I think things like a blockchain will have a very different point of how it's going to be. The demand for blockchain, not from a business perspective but from a customer perspective, will be quite big.
Mm-hmm.
People will demand to know where things have come to them from.
Mm-hmm.
Video is going to be a very big move going forward, given everybody in the world. IBM has 90% of our staff working in this format. So I think video analytics, I think video usage is going to be, there's going to be a big change that has already happened. So let's watch that space in the next few months also. Long
Fascinating.
answer.
It's yeah, no, no, no. But that was really insightful. Thank you for that. No, that makes a lot of sense, right? So there are certain technologies that sure are interesting now, but then there's going to be all sorts of new technologies in the very near future to adapt to
Yeah.
this new way of living and working. That makes total sense. And actually, while we're on the lines of these emerging technologies and what we're seeing in the future, I feel like even just looking into how we view technology today is also pretty important because
Yeah.
I feel like emerging technologies are great, right? And some of them, like artificial intelligence, amazing technology, and they are genuinely quite impactful. But then there's all this hype around technology, and a lot of the times the hype is kind of out of phase, out of sync with the actual technology. And in this series, I really want to emphasize that we want to stay as close to the real technology as possible, right? We want to stay realistic. We want to stay grounded. We don't want to, think, hey, maybe 100 years from now, AI will be sentient. We don't want to think like that. We want to be as realistic as possible.
Yeah.
We don't just want to follow along with the hype. And AI is just a simple example. There's all sorts of technologies. You talked about blockchain. There's all sorts of conflicting, very conflicting, sort of polar opinions on whether or not blockchain's a good thing or whether or not it's truly impactful. So I want to
Mhm.
get your opinions on which technologies today have the worst hype to impact ratios, the ones with the most hype, but the least actual impact on society.
Ah, yes. Oh, so many. So look, I work in technology. There's so many, and they're minor. There's some of them are, if you look at just the startup land, the things that you hear coming out from there. Um, but you know what? This is not new. This is not about just today, though. It's always been there. Human innovation has just caused this to happen forever, and it is not going to go away. If I 3D printing. People just thought everybody will be having a 3D printer in the home, like a microwave replacement, and just didn't go there. AI to the like when I started, it's always funny. I remember the first, let's say in the 2014, 15 timeframe, um, just talking about AI automatically, almost every conversation was a direct link to Hollywood. The it was like expected. I was expecting that moment in a conversation. So I, every one of them have had some form. In 20 years ago when mobile payments started, it was too early. It was just too early. And I think that's the part which we forget, which is it's context to the hype that makes a big difference. Like it was in
Yes.
1995 when IBM created the first smartphone. Who knew? It was called IBM
Fascinating.
Simon. So if you just look it up, whoever's on, or if you're, the people that are attending this call, just look up IBM Simon sometime. And IBM built the first smartphone. It was 1995. We sold a whopping 50,000 of them. So it was early. Was that a hype? Yes, it was a hype at that point of time, but the rest is history. So I reckon we have to be conscious of that part of it, where there will always be um, innovation that causes hype, and our imagination causes that, the excitement that goes with it. So, but also that's why we are using smartphones today. That's why somebody can 3D print a spanner in space.
Yes.
So that won't go. There is a. I don't know if you reach, and as you were saying, I was talking about. I just remembered. I don't know if you've ever read Douglas Adams. He's a British author, very funny guy, very smart. He was a tech geek also himself, and he had said the technology that you're born with, whatever technology is current that you're born with, is normal. It's how life is. The technology created, invented when you're 15 to 35, um, that's exciting. That's new. That's going to change the world. You'll build a career out of it. Technology created after you're 35 is against the laws of nature. It is funny to hear, and I'm paraphrasing, by the way. That's not the exact quote. You can just look it
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
But I think that is just so human, when you bring hype cycles and responding to
Wow.
hype.
Yeah, yeah, no, that adds a lot of context. You're right. That's fascinating to think about, really. The technology that's invented between the ages of what, 15 and 35?
Yes, I mean, obviously that changes,
Around
and the
that
pace of
range.
technology
Yeah.
also changes, and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
that
yeah,
stuff.
but yeah, around that much. Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. And I mean, I feel like you mentioned one specific example from your answer, and that was artificial intelligence technology. That's something that
Yep.
I'm really passionate about, as you know. And also,
Yep.
pause for just one moment. Everybody on the live stream right now, just so you know, at the end there will be a live Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to put that in the actual live chat, and we'll get to that. If you're wondering why I keep looking over here, it's because I'm taking a look at your questions, moderating them, making sure if there's anything interesting we can touch upon that, and we will get to them momentarily. Back to the discussion. As I was saying, you mentioned artificial intelligence, and I find that really fascinating. Um, and personally, I think that AI or machine learning, whatever you want to call it in this case, it has a very high impact level, but it also has a really high hype level. In fact, I think way more than it should, in my opinion. And I've noticed that as I've seen people working with AI, as I've seen decision makers trying to figure out where to put AI technology, those misconceptions are actually not just benign. They're not just like there and they are a misconception. They're sometimes actively harmful. And
Hmm.
what I mean by harmful is that they cause us to ask the wrong questions, right? Like questions like, and this is just one example, things like, do robots deserve rights like humans, right? These are questions that don't necessarily have a lot of logic behind them because the technology isn't even remotely similar to what you would call a human, something that deserves rights. But anyway, that's a discussion for a different time. But because it causes us to ask those questions, we invest in the wrong areas and we invest time and money where it's not really supposed to be spent. So, what are your opinions on sort of dismantling these misconceptions? What are some productive ways to go about doing that? And what are some of the disadvantages to having those misconceptions, which would become reasons that people would want to actively make sure they understand technology?
That's a very broad. The issue is a broad issue, but the answer is quite,
Yeah.
simple, I guess, to one extent. You're right. AI has had a massive bubble as an idea. Um, it has had it many times. It's not
Mm-hmm.
This is not the first time that's happened. They have had at least three cycles like this. What's different about this time is the technology was a lot more accessible. Suddenly, you had people who could read a book, but also at the same time try it out. So the problem, though, was what the expectations or the extrapolation of that little proof of concept or a little idea. Look, I tested this model out. Um, when that's deployed in the real world, it's a very different discussion. I've been lucky in many ways, I guess, because the people I've worked with, generally in large organizations, are wired for a little more infinite thinking, in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that that's a Simon Sinek, in a response where it's not about this project, it's about the long-term thinking.
Mm-hmm.
How will this impact my customer? How will this impact data privacy? How will this impact um, legality? And good thing is, most of large organizations are so wired to think like that, they will generally err on the side of caution.
Mm-hmm.
So they will not do so. Now, that can be frustrating for somebody who is a technologist who's saying, come on, just get it done. Why are you holding back? True story. So there's a bank that we were working with, and it was a virtual agent discussion. So it was a Watson assistant conversation, Watson assistant project. And the business team loved it, the tech team loved it. But when it went to legal, it took us 6 months to go through legal, right?
Wow.
So it has already been approved it has already gone through all the privacy discussions, it's already gone through all the data. sovereignty, customer data, all of the conversations done. But legal had just not come across terms like services in the
Oh.
context that they were used to. So, but it's good that they are wired like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that just keeps the business continuity discussion at a completely different level. So, to answer your original question, is it, you know, is this a bad thing in regards to, can this be harmful? Yeah, it absolutely can if you don't do it right. And I think this is why there's a responsibility of the people building the AI to appreciate the impact that the AI will have and also not oversell the idea of what that will do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is what it does. This is what it, if it's a pure machine learning algorithm, that this is what it predicts or optimizes. Yeah. If it is a deep learning, then this is how the payload works through the model. And this is how you need to make sure that they are transparent in the final outcome.
Mm-hmm.
You need to think of that. And there are processes that should be put into place to manage that process.
That
And, and,
makes
and that links to skills and that links into organizational behavior and all that kind of
mm-hmm.
stuff.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel like one point that you mentioned there in specific, not overselling the capability of a technology, that's something that is a maybe like a bad habit that a lot of people have, overselling the capability of a technology. I feel like a lot of technologists, people that are pure developers, researchers, don't really have that habit. But then when it comes to like sales, marketing, you tend to get into the
Yeah.
realm of otherworldly technology, and so this is fascinating stuff, and we've talked quite a bit about innovation, but I want
I
to
have
kind of
I have a tip
yes.
on that one, then, man.
Oh yeah, okay.
What I tell organizations that I work with
Mm-hmm.
is when you are talking to, and I don't mean this only from an IBM perspective. I mean, as like when I talk to any organization who is looking at
Yeah.
AI, ask the seller who is going to implement it.
Ah, okay.
It's a simple question
Mm-hmm.
because the person who will implement it knows what's coming up ahead, right? Or speak to the technologist to be
Mm-hmm.
able to architect the right solution in the context of
Yes.
their technologists.
Yes.
I think it's when you, as soon as you have that conversation, things change.
I I love what you just mentioned there. That is absolutely exceptional. This is a key takeaway for everybody. Ask the technologist. Talk to the people that understand the technology when you're talking to the people building your solution. As a matter of fact, I mean, I've always said that it's really important to bridge the gap between domain experts and technologists because what the technologist knows and what the domain expert knows, those are two things that, if put together the right way, can build better solutions than
Yeah.
any of these two could ever individually build. So yeah, I totally agree with what you just said. That is a key takeaway for everybody. And I kind of want to pivot our conversation a little bit right now. I mean, you work at Red Hat. Red Hat, if the first thing that comes to a developer's mind when they hear Red Hat, if it's not Linux, it's open source. Because I mean, Red Hat is an almost completely open source company, as far as I know. Correct?
Correct.
Wonderful.
Not almost
So,
completely.
oh,
Completely.
completely open source company. That is
Yeah.
amazing. And I mean, we've talked about this emerging technology, but then there's also the question of how do we take technology this complex, this broad, this powerful, and how do we scale up its development? I mean, as we invent more and more things, the rate at which each thing continues to grow, you would think that it kind of slows down because we have less people working on each individual technology or product or whatever. This bubble of human knowledge is growing and growing, and we need more and more people to work on expanding it. So I feel like open source is like the perfect way to solve this, right? Because then you've got the whole community coming together and working towards a single robust solution to almost any problem. And
Mhm.
the open source community, essentially what it does is, I feel like the best way to, in my opinion, really sum it down would be it prevents us from reinventing the wheel. Right? Anything that's already
Yeah.
there, there's no need to reinvent it. We can modify it to our liking. I mean, as a matter of fact, this entire webinar is being powered by open source technology. We've got the open broadcaster, we've got an Nginx server doing the routing, we've got open source stuff. So instead of me having to buy like $600 software, I can run it on open source tech, and it's just as, if not more robust than that commercial grade software. So in your opinion, I want to know about two things. First of all, why is open source important? But also, how can open source be a sustainable business model? Because a lot of people think, and there's this like stigma associated with open source, it's going away slowly, but it's still kind of there. And that is that, hey, if it's open source, then it's free, you're not going to earn any money, right? So open source is just for side projects or something of that sort. But that's not the case. I mean, Red Hat's earning, earning X. What was Red Hat's revenue last year?
I don't know about the revenue, but it was $34 billion acquisition.
It was a $34 billion acquisition from IBM. Yeah, exactly. So Red Hat, $34 billion acquisition from IBM as a completely open source company. And so I want to get your thoughts. How can people create a sustainable business model with open source, and why is that important?
Oh, if you asked me this question before I got to this current role, I would have a very different point of view, honestly. And I
Okay.
think I've learned so much about not just Red Hat, but the open source community and what drives them. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the key word there is community, where
Mm-hmm.
open source, so I'll come to the business model in a bit. I think
Mm-hmm.
the first part about open source is the sheer pace of change of technology today. It's
Mm-hmm.
not possible for one company to have 20 developers, 30 developers, 100 developers, 1,000 developers building a product. It's just not sustainable. It's not competitive. It's not possible to grow in that manner.
Mm-hmm.
What open source does is it creates communities who help each other, who share code, and they build solutions, they build technology, and then it's a growing uh, virtuous cycle as it grows through the process. Now, that's the good part of that, obviously, and the
Mm-hmm.
negative side to that. I think you're touching on this, which is um, okay, so I'm a business. Can I really take this technology and run my customer data on that? Can I really put this on a shared cloud somewhere and put
Yeah.
my core banking application on that? And not answer is yes, but not in by just downloading and putting it up. And that is where things like certification, that's where people like Red Hat come in, who
Mm-hmm.
will take and support the community. There's a community builds the way Red Hat does it is they call it project versus product. So project is basically the upstream open source projects that are happening out there.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, Fedora, which is the Red Hat Linux open source project equivalent, which they won't
Yes.
support, and the community supports. But if you want to run your customers' data application, your core banking system, you want to get Red Hat Enterprise Linux,
Mm-hmm.
which is the supported environment, which is the product whose
Mm-hmm.
subscription Red Hat sells.
Uh-huh.
So that's how the model really plays through. And it is honestly, it's a thing of beauty to watch it and manage because if you think about it, we bought a company of $34 billion, and we can talk about why that happened. And that's obviously, this is a conversation that will continue for a while, but they don't actually have any IP per se that they own that they brought
Mm-hmm.
in that 34 billion. Everything Red Hat does is open sourced.
Mm-hmm.
If they have acquired a company, they have open sourced it. And that
Fascinating.
ethos runs through the organization. So the
Yes.
company is what is called an open organization.
Interesting.
And have a look at there's a great book called The Open Organization by Jim Whitehurst. Fantastic
Mm-hmm.
read.
Mm-hmm.
I
Fascinating.
don't know
Thank you
if
for
I
letting me know.
answered your question.
No, I mean, I think you touched upon the right points there. I mean, it's really interesting to see how Red Hat is a completely open source organization. I absolutely love that. The fact that anything they do, any acquisitions they make, it's all open source. It's an open organization. I love that, and I also like how you touched upon the trade offs there a little bit. Do you so I mean, we always think that, hey, technology is great, and there's some technologies like open source technology in specific that we really tend to mostly focus on the positives for. We don't really tend to take a look at the trade-offs that, or at least talk about it that often. Same thing with AI, same thing with a lot of other technologies. We seem to quite narrowly focus on this is why it's amazing, but then we end up noticing that, hey, there are these issues with this technology that we didn't necessarily realize because no one talked about them. So is there any like sort of common pitfall with open source, or something that an issue that a lot of people experience with open source technology that you kind of want to touch upon and sort of warn people in advance so they can keep that in mind when they're planning out what they want to do with open source?
Yeah. Yeah, so there are quite a few. Obviously, firstly, what's the use case? I would start from there. And I think that's the main part people forget a lot. Um, Again, true story. I was talking to an airline, a solution architect in an airline, probably around September timeframe, and we got into conversations about OpenShift and container orchestration, etc. And he goes, why should we get OpenShift? I can get Kubernetes, which is free. I can just download and put it on somewhere. I'm like, okay, have you done that? He goes, yeah, it's been running great for the last almost year and a half now. We've been running all our literally it was said as all our workloads are running on Kubernetes vanilla. Like, great. So what do you do when it goes down? Oh, it never goes down. And as soon as he said it, the person in the room actually said, really? And no, I could see the conversation going on between themselves when they realized that no, that's true. It went down for like something like 3 times in the last 6 months. The point is not that it went down for 3 times in the last. What do you do then?
Mm-hmm.
If you have your booking system running on that at that point of time, what do you do?
Yeah.
Is it really worth this conversation? So the first, I think, pitfall is people thinking that I will just get the open source. So it's all open source. I'll get the free downloadable community edition and run my production workloads on that. Now, going by the how I mentioned business, the bigger businesses aren't wired like that. Generally, they are not. And so production workloads will not be put into that kind of
Mm-hmm.
framework. But POCs, and it's good. You want to do a little POC, you want to do a little test of something, go for it. So the first pitfall I look for is, I'd suggest don't just because it's free, don't go down that path. Look at somebody who will support that and maintain that for you. The other
Mm-hmm.
part to look at is how big is the project. So is it something that just started 6 months ago? It's got, 3 players typing something and submitting code on a regular basis, or
Yeah.
is it a 3,000 contributors in that project? And that's
Mm-hmm.
been running for the last 5 years, 6 years. I think so
Mm-hmm.
that's the second part to look at to see the viability of the technology. And I guess the other thing to look out is how many vendors are. Is it like a single vendor who's building a project and just putting a source code out there?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a lot of people contributing to it? So just so the contribution should be fairly diverse in nature, not just
Yes.
a single vendor.
Yes.
Just some things to think about when it comes to open source usage.
Interesting. I like that last thing you mentioned in specific, having a diverse number of contributors to the code, a diverse group of contributors to the code, and I feel like a perfect example that personifies this is if you were to tell people that Darwin, which is like the base OS behind Mac OS and iOS and tvOS and watchOS, if you tell them that it's open source and that like literally the base operating system for iOS is open source, they wouldn't believe
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
right? But it is. It's just not open source in the way you expect. I mean, Linux has IBM and Microsoft and Amazon and Google and even Apple contributing
Well,
to it.
the internet runs on Linux.
Exactly, literally, the internet does run on Linux.
Yeah.
But then you've got Darwin over here, which is just Apple's contributing to it, and they happen to publish the source code every once in a while, so it's technically open source, but it's not really open source in the way that we think about open source. So yeah, that's that. I feel like that's a great way to frame it in terms of a mental model of how you want to sort of approach implementing open source into your organization or into your product. And now I want to sort of pivot in between the first two things that we talked about. So we talked about innovation, we talked about open source. Now I want to talk about the actual application of emerging technology in industries and sort of like real life examples. You've already shared a lot. Thank you for that. Those are really insightful. But some real life examples of, for example, when you have seen a business leader or a decision maker making what you believe to be a wrong decision or making what you believe to be a difficult or maybe necessarily not necessarily wrong but a really difficult decision, and what was the outcome of that decision, and the idea behind this is that decision should revolve around emerging technology.
Multiple. So, okay. Let me,
Maybe
if I put into,
Yeah,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
just to interrupt a little bit. Maybe what you would want to do, and there's a more specific example that I'll get into in just a moment that I want to get your thoughts on because this is like futuristic stuff. But maybe, and I feel like it would be useful to tap into your experience as the CTO of Watson. I want to see what were some of the misconceptions that people had. What were some of the
Yeah.
parts where they just got stuck and they were like, I don't know what to do from here.
Yeah. No, those are okay. The ones where they say I'm stuck and I don't know what to do from here, that's okay because I
Mm-hmm.
can help when somebody is in that mind space already. That's good. The problem happens is when they have a misconception and I have to intervene and say that is probably not the right thing in the long run, what you're trying to do here. Those
Yeah.
are the ones that get a little, I have to be a lot more tactful when and I'm not good with that because I just say it as it is. So
Yeah.
I think those are the ones that get a little harder. Okay, let's take a few examples. There was a telco that I was working with, and they wanted to have a system that could put in voice, and so it was at that time speech to text, text to speech, integrated with this is before we had all of that integrated together with an assistant at the back on a phone call, and they had already got quotes from different people who was going to do things, and that's when they had come to me to have the conversation of Watson. And they had already kind of made up their mind as to how they go about it without actually thinking the user experience of
Mm-hmm.
that solution that they were putting together.
Mm-hmm.
So having an automated virtual assistant on the phone is fine with voice, provided you can control the variables around the sound,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like this was going to be a kiosk
Mm-hmm.
on a shopping mall floor,
Mm-hmm.
at the same time allow people to make a phone call through this application without considering train, without considering the shopping mall ambient noise. There's a whole stack of stuff. So I didn't. So I obviously I kind of when we had that interaction, I basically said these are this is what was wrong with it. This is what's right with it. This is what you need to do with it. And the story turned better towards a while later because it took a while for the person to digest the fact that how risky the situation was, what he was about to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's when it becomes really hard, especially if you're a senior person in industry who are so used to having vendors just telling you, yes, you want to do this, yes, you should do it. And this is how much it'll cost to do it. So those become hard when you're doing what's it, when you're doing AI.
Mm-hmm.
I have been very lucky though. So I've had the opportunity to work with the likes of Woodside. I've had the likes of, work with Westpac, and it's been amazing journeys, but not all of them are like that.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to tell it as it is pretty early on.
Yeah, makes sense. And so one example that I did want to touch upon there, for some reason it's escaping my mind right now, but there was one example I was gonna give that I felt would. Oh yes. So in the middle, you mentioned something along the lines of they have this preconceived notion of something that they want to talk about, or something that they want to do, and then they work forward from there. They're like, we want to do this, and they don't really think about the user experience. We want to use these technologies. We want to achieve this use case, and they just want to implement it. They don't think about what the user is going to experience if they use that software, use that whatever it is. And I feel like a good analogy would kind of be, why do people enjoy Apple products in the first place? Right? What makes Apple special? I feel like in the research that I've done, or in what I've noticed them doing, it's that they work from the user experience backward, not from functionality forward. Right? So they don't think, hey, we want to implement this feature in iOS. How's it going to impact user experience? Rather, they think, all right, the user experience is whatever. Now, can we work back from this to change our
Mhm.
functionality or our devices or whatever? I mean, perfect example would be battery life on the iPhone. Instead of just plopping twice the battery density or twice the number of batteries in the iPhone, which, I mean, they did increase battery capacity. Instead, they worked on making a many times more efficient CPU. So that way, it's generating less heat, it's using less power, we can still have the same battery, so it's around the same weight, it's still as thin, and you get your battery life compromise. So people were asking Apple, put a bigger battery in, but really what they wanted was better battery life, and Apple realized that. So if we could expand that analogy from Apple and commercial to enterprise, I feel like a lot of software in the market And not it's not even just software. I keep saying software, but it's really everything, hardware. Everything would be so much better and more meaningful. And I feel like, again, that's something that people need to realize and sort of be open to molding their ideas and really working from a problem first perspective.
So I couldn't agree with more with you on that particular point, right? So I think Apple's done a fantastic job in exactly that part of it.
Hmm.
I know I gave sellers, and I think we jointly did this earlier, a hard time about getting to speak to the technologies. I gotta say though, the good sellers do this really well.
Hmm.
Good sellers who go out there and meet the customer, they have it. They just intuitively have this conversation of starting with why
Yes.
and starting with the user experience. And I think when you have those kind of people in the journey,
Hmm.
makes a huge difference.
It absolutely does. Final question before we get into the live Q&A. We're going to try and keep this one short so we can move on
Sure.
because there are a couple of questions coming in, but do share whatever it is that you have in mind. One application that I really love, and I've got to say, of all the different AI apps out there, all the different machine learning apps out there, there are two that are my favorite. Number one, Watson playing Jeopardy. That's my all-time sort of favorite application of machine learning. It's sort of super fascinating to see how it can understand and comprehend such complex natural language. And that was a research grand challenge, an IBM research grand challenge. The next IBM research grand challenge is Project Debater. Now, Project Debater, just for those in the audience who may not have heard of it, is an application that is around engaging in debate against human debate champions and trying to win, or at least trying to get the point across in a persuasive manner. And Project Debater did a really good job at this. So computational argumentation is sort of like at the cutting edge of research right now, and it's really useful technology. It can help us make better decisions by taking a look at a lot of different arguments across hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of sentences of natural language data to try and find the key points to persuade someone for or against a certain debate motion or a certain topic or whatever it is. Um, and so, my question for you, Dave, is Project Debater technology, at least certain components of it, are now being integrated into the Watson suite of APIs. So, for that technology in specific, what are some misconceptions or issues that you can envision today, even as not necessarily having implemented this technology, just by hearing about it? What are some issues that you envision people could experience, or that they will think of, and what would your advice be to work around those issues?
It won't be unlike any of the prior issues that people respond to emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be just another one of those, oh my God, machine does blah, right? So I think there's that fear, there's the emotional response to a lot of this. So I'm not worried about that. It's going to happen. It is a fascinating project though. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, when the first time I heard about debater, this is what, going back a year and a half now, 2 years I think now.
Approximately.
When I first saw the internal side, when I saw debater, the light bulb that went off in my head was this:
Mm-hmm.
a job of a good AI is to give us the good answer or the right answer.
Yep.
The job of the human being is to ask the right question.
Yes.
But what if we got help from AI for that also?
Yes.
What if we could have a debate with an AI in some form? It will not be in the form and obviously the screen that we've
Yeah.
seen, in some form, to come up with the right question. With the sheer amount of bad data out there, the sheer amount of fake data out there,
Yeah.
if we could have a system that could ingest it all and come up with a point of view that I can debate with to come up with my question, it completely changes. It just takes the decision making to a completely different level.
Mm-hmm.
That's what excites me about debate, and I think that people will see that as soon as that comes out.
Fascinating. All right. So it's great to get your thoughts on that. Thank you very much. This was a really insightful discussion. And I feel like now we can transition into the more interactive portion. If you have any questions for me, you can let me know.
Uh, I have got, look, you know what? I guess anybody on this call, they have probably got questions for you, not for me, honestly. So I won't be surprised.
No.
Look, no, look, I think we've been talking about, we've been talking about AI. We've been talking about, and everybody knows your passion around AI. We've been talking about technology. We're talking about organizations and making, different decisions about technology. When I talk to people about it, I talk about careers. I talk about helping people, in their careers with AI, and
Mhm.
and building teams around that. You are unique in that sense where you're 16 and you already have a career, and you've probably had more accomplishments in that period of your career, more than anybody else your age, probably twice that age.
Thank you.
What would you be telling people to think about when it comes to all these new technologies, or just preparing for life? Let's say to a high school student about to leave school, or a university student about to leave university and has just done a tech degree.
Yeah, sure. That's a really interesting question. And I mean, first of all, before we get to what I would say to like high school students or university students about to leave, um, first of all, when it comes to me and how I learn, I would say what enables me to learn about technology is the fact that I don't try and restrict myself to a certain set curriculum or a certain set of topics that I need to learn about. Like for example, in regular school, you would have to say, for the rest of the year, you're going to be learning these things, and that's it. Right? This is going to be the extent of your knowledge in the next 1 year. But what's nice is that because I'm homeschooled and because I have the flexibility around how I learn, I can dynamically and organically grow the set of knowledge that I gain, and this can be done out of even just sheer curiosity. Like, I mean, even when I had to learn like LLVM, which is like this complex compiler tooling for a project actually at IBM for the DB2 org, as I was learning LLVM compiler tooling and how it works, I didn't just read a book and become an expert in LLVM. I looked for open source projects. This is where open source comes back in, right? I would take a look at how they work. I would try and replicate them myself. And when I couldn't find something out, I would try and research that and even take a look at other resources like books again. It comes back to that. And sort of organically grow what it is that I learned. So I feel like, first of all, I would recommend that while high school or college or university, whatever it is, while those institutions provide you a platform on which you can learn, at the end of the day, it's up to you how you actually want to learn and apply what you learn. Right? So I believe that first of all, it's important that for the future of technology, you're able to adapt quickly because this technology is changing at an exponentially growing pace. So being able to adapt quickly by learning by experience is something that I think is really valuable. So making sure that yes, university, high school, great. That's providing me with a framework that I can use to learn new concepts. But don't take everything that you learn very literally. I mean, people think, how, as they learn like simple calculus in high school or whatever, they think, how am I going to use this in my everyday life? What they don't realize is you're not going to be using calculus. You're going to be using the problem solving framework that calculus teaches you to solve other problems. That's what's important. How did humans come up with that concept of finding a derivative of a function? That's what we want to teach you. So understanding that you get this sort of mental model from school or whatever, but then it's up to you to organically grow your knowledge base is something that is really important. And the only way you can really do that effectively is if what you're learning about is something that you're passionate about, right? Like I love working with technology. It's just I find it fascinating. I just like working with tech, and because of that, no matter what it is, if it's related to tech in some way, or even other topics like language or psychology, if it's related to these topics, I just want to learn more about it, and this sort of organic knowledge growing just happens. And so I would say that it's being able to expand your knowledge base, creating a mental framework of problem solving that you can apply across domains, and being passionate about what it is that you're learning about are really the three keys to this.
I love it. I love it. Thank you. And I don't think that's
Of
an
course.
answer for school students and uni students at all. I think that's for everybody.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I mean, the more generalized it is, the better. That's for everybody, really, to see how you can learn in the most effective way possible. So thank you very much, Dave, for your question and
Thank
for the
you.
discussion. This was really, really fascinating to me. I learned a lot during it. And now let's take a look at what questions the audience has and see how we can answer them. So let's start off over here. I see we have a question from Clement, and the question is: it is important to introduce technology to students at as young of an age as possible. And I'm gonna interject here a little bit. And again, the reason that I believe this is important is because the younger you learn technology, the more generalized the problem solving framework that it teaches you can be. So overall, it's better for everything you learn, in my opinion. Getting back to Clement's question, it's important to introduce technology to students as young as possible or as early as possible to prepare them for the future. So, how would you advise schools to get on board to actually introducing technology to students? So, I want to get your thoughts on this, and then we can expand from there.
Uh, So thank you, Clement. And I think this is something that I am passionate about personally. I do spend a lot of time um, working with schools. I work with universities, and I try to spend as much time as I can with a couple of universities here in Australia and some schools. So IBM actually does a lot of work with schools, and I've been lucky enough to be part of that. So, for example, in India, there's a curriculum called the CBSE syllabus, and IBM is working on building the AI framework for the K to 12, initially for the 11, 12. So, answer your question, yes, is the first point is totally agree. That's just I think, and I think when you mention exposure to technology, you don't mean exposure to an iPad or a TV. You're talking about learning, doing, hands-on
Yeah.
coding. And I think there is a lot of good material available on that for kids. If you haven't tried it yet, try out Scratch. My son, he's 9. He actually enjoys Scratch a fair bit. Nowadays, there's technology available within other programs. So Minecraft, for example, has a Minecraft EDU, which is free. I think maybe just check that, but it has a Minecraft EDU allows you to code in them, and you can start with block coding and then move to even things like Python and JavaScript within it itself. So there's a lot of opportunity right now on that.
Wonderful. That's good. So there's all sorts of resources. It's important, and thank you for your thoughts on that. I'm sure that was great. And another thing that I would recommend, really quickly, you mentioned a couple of resources to get into the world of like programming and technology and actually doing. Of course, it's important to get into next generation technology after that. But one sort of word of caution that I would say is a lot of people think, hey, we should introduce AI or machine learning to kids, or we should introduce next generation technology to kids, or even just a lot of people in general, when they learn about tech, they think, hey, I want to learn about AI. But really, again, what I think is important to remember is that you're going to learn the act of telling the computer what you want it to do generically. Right? It's not what technology you're applying, AI or blockchain or IoT or cloud. That's just another tool in your tool belt that you use to solve problems. You are learning how to interact with a computer and get it to do what you want it to do. You're not learning specifically how I'm going to do AI with computers. That's not, in my opinion, the way that you should frame that problem. So that's one thing. Now, from there, we have a question from the YouTube live chat. This is for you, Dave. What are the top tech companies or concepts to get into today, especially in Australia?
Apart from IBM, I'm guessing that question. IBM, of course. So there's two different topics there. So top tech company. Look, Australia is fairly lucky that way. We have a lot of good, they're startups. They're doing some great stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There is obviously the big tech companies. IBM is here. Go to the IBM careers side. There are a lot of good, jobs always available for that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's there. The big companies are there. The mid-sized ones there. And funnily enough, with tech nowadays, everybody is a tech company. I think people forget that
Mm-hmm.
just to be in tech, you don't need to be in a tech company.
Yeah.
Every bank is a tech company. Car
One
manufacturers are tech companies.
One thing
Hey,
I'm
go
going to
ahead.
mention, I actually love what you just said. Every company is a tech company. A couple of years ago, I was in Arkansas at the Walmart headquarters for a talk. And, you usually think, hey, Walmart's just groceries, right? You go there, you get your groceries, eat some McDonald's, you come back home, whatever, right? But the thing is, when I went to the Walmart headquarters, I realized that Walmart is heavily invested in technology to the point that their forensics lab for cybersecurity stuff, other companies hire Walmart for their cybersecurity. Right.
Yeah.
So to think that Walmart is that engrossed within technology is incredible. But please go ahead, continue.
No, you're right, but that's it. That's a great example. And I think people forget. So don't think of if you want to join tech, it's not about joining government. I mean, come on,
Mm-hmm.
there's a huge amount of tech jobs in government nowadays. So that's one side of it. From a tech itself as to what are the emerging techs, yes, so like learn about it from an infrastructure side of things. There's cloud, there is containers, there is open source, there's Kubernetes, OpenShift. From
Mm-hmm.
a AI side, there's obviously the Watson stack and so many other AI tech out there. So you won't be wrong right now with choice of technology.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. All right, so we have a lot of different questions. I'm not sure if we'll be able to get to all of them. Just in case we don't, by the way, we will answer them later on the chat. But we'll keep going. So next up, we see another question. Question for you, Dave. Actually, what's your favorite programming language?
Oh my goodness. Well, okay, you know what? This is showing age. Many of you probably don't even know it. It's only because I started my job with that language. There was a language called Perl.
Perl.
It's PHP kind of time frame, and I, I used to work for a company in India, and I learned Perl through that. So I've done a lot of hard yards with Perl. Nowadays, I guess things like Node.js is it's fairly active, and I probably
Yeah.
spend more time with Node.js. But I
Yeah.
still have this fascination for Perl going
Really.
years back.
I will just quickly mention you said Perl. Here in the DB2 org, a lot of test cases are written in Perl, and while I can't give you more details than that, because live stream,
It's a great
there,
language.
so no. So here's the thing: the test cases are written in Perl, and the developers on DB2 dislike it so much they once tried to write a Perl to Python converter just to convert all their test cases. Anyhow,
I'm not
um,
surprised.
yeah. So the reason that I mentioned this question was because we have a question from Mahendra on the live stream, and he asks, which programming languages will be used mostly for AI? One thing that I will mention before I hand it over to you, Dave, is that I think that today the most used language is Python, but I think that's going to be dying out soon. No, not necessarily soon, but in the future it will, because Python wasn't meant for the things we do with it today. If you take a look at TensorFlow, for example, in graph building, it's like a language within a language. You can't use Python control flow or constructs. You've got to somehow use the TensorFlow API from within the Python language. And it's just weird. Like, I mean, even just yesterday, literally at like 12 a.m. here, I was working on debugging a TensorFlow graph issue where the CTC loss that I was trying to apply to my neural network wasn't working, but it won't tell me what line it's not working on because it's failing somewhere within the graph and not within my code. So I feel like Python's going out, and the next few languages coming in will be languages like Swift and Julia, where the compilers themselves have been architected in a way that enables rapid and productive machine learning development, first class support for machine learning within the language. So, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think the
I
next
think you've
big
already
programming
answered
language
the
will be?
question. But for anybody who doesn't, if you're not into AI right now, and if you're looking at
Mm-hmm.
starting right now, there is quite. I mean, there's obviously TensorFlow there, PyTorch, Cafe,
Mm-hmm.
then a Torch. There are the whole stack of technologies out there. I'm not mentioning Watson here because that's not a language by itself.
Yeah.
You call Watson with a language of your own. So
Yeah.
uh, yeah, there are
That
plenty. But I think you already answered the question.
That actually ties very well into our next question from Sumit. And his question is that technology is getting simplified so we can democratize its access to as many people as possible. And Watson's a perfect example of this. A lot of the different APIs that Watson provides are quite generic. There's Watson Machine Learning, which is a bit of an outlier where you give it your own code and it runs that on hardware. But then the rest of the services are pretty simple. There's graphical interfaces, it's a REST API, super simple to call. And so, should new developers focus more on these new ways of doing things, or should they still be learning coding? I already kind of touched upon this, and I'm saying, remember that Watson or whatever is just another tool in your tool belt. You should still be learning how to code just as you would before. It's just now you can also use Watson. But what are your thoughts on that?
I think answer is yes to both.
Mm-hmm.
Is basically it, right? So I think people forget that AI is such a big topic. There's different kinds of specialities that you're going to have. You're going to have people who uh, don't know how a visual recognition engine works, but they
Mm-hmm.
know how to develop an application that will
Mm-hmm.
call an existing visual recognition engine. There are
Mm-hmm.
people who know how to build a visual recognition engine. There'll be people who know what happens here, but I'll only focus on the user aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
So AI is has already, and there'll be even more. There will be specializations, and there's no this or that.
Hmm.
It's going to be all of them.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And there's another question from Ivan. He says that blockchain has excellent application in banking, but do you think there will be drawbacks because governments can't control it? Now, I think this is something that you'd be able to answer quite well, but I feel like the entire point of blockchain is that no one controls it, right? No government, no individual, no entity can control the blockchain. I feel like that's the whole advantage of it. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm just trying to say respond to the way the question has been framed, which is will there be drawbacks on the if the government cannot control it? Look, I think Ethereum, Bitcoin, the currency aspect of it is out there, and governments can't control it. It's there, so it is. I don't think that's the discussion there. The discussion is from a banking perspective. Is blockchain is about a network.
Hmm.
You cannot set up your own blockchain and be the one person using it. It's like
Yeah.
having the only phone number in the world.
Hmm.
So once you have a network set up, once you have a collaboration set up, then the
Hmm.
blockchain will work. So I reckon until and unless, and this is actually happening in Australia. Australia is doing some really good stuff in regards to the major banks coming together to set up platforms, and it's going to happen globally.
Hmm.
So I don't think it's a government thing only. It's also about just commercially doing the right things for customers and and broad society.
Hmm. Makes a lot of sense. So, from here, another question, and this is pivoting back to AI. What will be the effect of artificial intelligence on mankind? Will it make people lazy and effortless? And there's an
Oh,
example
I
that I'm
wish.
kind of forgetting right now, and it's an example that I actually got from a guy at a university or at a conference. And unfortunately, I'm forgetting who I got it from. But he was in Europe and he traveled to the US one time and he went to a grocery store and he got like just two items. And these weren't the actual prices of the items. I'm just making this up for now. It was just like $6 and say $5, right? And he goes to the cashier and tries to purchase the items. But before the cashier is like, you've got a total of $11, instead of just adding six and five in the cashier's mind, they actually went to their calculator and did 6 plus 5 and then calculated that manually. And the thing that a lot of people think about is, I mean, isn't this a perfect example of humans not having to do that mental math or do that work? And the way I like to think about it is 6 plus 5 isn't something that we evolved to do, right? For 4 billion years, humans did not evolve with the selective pressure of we have to be able to add numbers quickly or even accurately or even at all. It's just we are using our general purpose reasoning capabilities and memorization capabilities to expand to be able to do math. We weren't supposed to be able to do it. We just happened to be able to. So, in my opinion, what's really happening is we are offloading tasks that we shouldn't be doing over to technology so that we can take up tasks that we should. A better example would be driving. Humans are one of the only animals with blind spots. We have no selective pressure to be able to drive accurately or safely, but we still do. And so, if we can offload those kinds of tasks that we didn't evolve to do to computers so that we can take up tasks that we did evolve to do, things like innovation and research and development and of technology and these sorts of things, then we're making the full use of our human capabilities. What do you think, Dave? And do you want to expand that to like other emerging technologies, not just AI? What do you think about that?
You're bang on. So, yes, the funny thing is, I'm wired slightly differently from an enterprise perspective. When you told that story about the adding of the six and the five and using a calculator, my first thought was in a business, they probably do that just to make sure that there is no risk at the point. And the person might have already calculated 11 in their head, but they'll use a calculator just to show the person that the machine says it's 11. So look, that's just context. But the point is, to the original question, will it make human beings lazy? No, that's been the promise. I haven't seen it yet. I reckon the way AI is has grown and it'll continue to grow, it is just another tool,
Mm-hmm.
and tools just make our lives easier so that we can do more.
Mm-hmm.
Today we use maps on our phones. We take directions. I've got home automation set up, and I don't need to turn off the light when I get up. But that doesn't make it lazy. I can spend that time doing something else.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's always that.
Perfect. Yeah, and I mean that makes total sense. People say, "Hey, a few years ago when I didn't have such a large contact list on my phone, I would remember all my friends' phone numbers and I had a really good memory." But like you're remembering other things now, things that are more
Correct.
important. You're doing more important things because your phone can remember your phone numbers for you. So that's the way I like to think about it, and I like your opinion on that. Another question: do you think that non-open source technology is dying out or will stay in our economy? I think it'll stay as something that we use alongside open source in terms of commercial tech. But what do you think?
It'll depend on specific use cases. So there will always be people who are at least for the next 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
possibly 20 years, where due to government usage, due to countries that are insular, due to societal frameworks that people will want to build, keep, control, sell.
Mm-hmm.
That will happen. That won't go away. Because don't forget, open source is not just about technology.
Mm-hmm.
Open source is about, well, it came out from this world, but it's everywhere. If you really think about it, historically, the first open source stuff that happened, and I don't mean the 1990s when IBM did the $1 billion Linux
Mm-hmm.
foundation. I'm talking about law. Law
Yeah.
is for me the classic use case of open source. There are people who are building stuff out, making decisions, and that becomes a precedence for the next one. And that's there and still remains, right? So
Yeah.
I think if you just take that perspective, it is a much bigger play. But to answer your question, I think open source is the future of technology development without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
It is the only way people can scale at the pace at which technology is growing.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. We have another question, and there's three more that I see immediately. Can we create AI that gives students study materials like questions in mathematics and increase the difficulty as students get comfortable? AI generated study materials for personalized learning. As far as I know, yes. There's been quite a few
Especially
attempts at
with
this.
maths. I mean, given maths the topic, yes. I think when it comes
Yes.
down to other more creative aspects to it, that's a different discussion.
There actually has been quite a bit of research done in this area. Watson used to have a Watson education division, and
Yep.
one of the things that Watson Education built was a neural network, and this is really fascinating stuff. A neural network that can take a question, a ground truth answer, and a student's answer and classify it as incorrect, partially correct, or correct. So even if it's worded completely differently, as long as it touches upon the same points and the same semantics, it can actually classify it. It's a really interesting network that's
Awesome.
internal to IBM at the moment, but I mean there are demo videos online that you can see, and this kind of technology is really fascinating to me. I mean, as you mentioned, for something like math, it's super easy because it's all structured. You can generate that pretty easily.
Right.
But it also goes to show that AI can be used for even more complex topics like language or history or science or things like this. So yes, I would say the answer to that is yes. I don't think there's a major product in the market that does something similar to this. There's McGraw Hill Alex, which does something on parallel line, which would be like recommendation of topics, not necessarily content generation. So from there, we have a question from Rajesh. He says, "What is the right path to get into artificial intelligence technology?" I feel like we've already covered this quite a bit. To recap, again, from my opinion, it is you start off with programming. You have to understand that you need to understand how to communicate with technology, how to get it to solve the problems that you want it to solve, get that computational thinking in your head, and then you can specialize in AI or any other technology. Anything else you want to add, Dave?
No, I think what's good now, and this wasn't there even 10 years ago or 5 years ago, is the amount of freely accessible information and education material available. So I know IBM put together, and Tanmay, I think you've done some work on it also, which is the cognitiveClass.ai. So if you
Yes.
have already done, you want to just start the conversation, go to it. It's free, and you could start learning to code. You can start learning Python. You could start doing data science on it, and AI.
Exactly. Wonderful. So from there, we have a couple more questions. Let me see which one we want to get into right now. There is a question that says, what are the top three AI skills? Again, I feel like we've kind of covered that in terms of the computational thinking. We just answered a similar question. Then we see, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what this means. What is the scope for automation tester to work with AI related stuff? So, automation tester. Hmm,
So I'm guessing that's a job role right now where somebody's testing automation,
probably.
is what it sounds like. And they're asking for that person to go into AI or where AI helps them. What's the question?
Where AI helps them.
I think that simulations is really the first one of those early use cases of AI, and I think
Yeah.
simulations will remain and get more and more sophisticated. I mean, if you look at the stuff that's happening in the video game industry and the 3D, visual industry, so simulations probably would be the biggest use case in automation testing,
Yep.
and that's going to become more and more sophisticated going forward.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And also, there's another question: how can artificial intelligence machine learning be used in surveillance in banking? So I would assume
You
that. I mean,
paused at surveillance, and then I was like, okay, surveillance in banking.
yeah, that's similar thought process.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, there's so much happening. I mean, I'm guessing when you say surveillance, you mean because that in a banking context, that means a lot of different things. It
Yeah.
could mean security, it could mean anti-money laundering, it could be risk, detection. It could be so surveillance is a big, broad spectrum, which
Yeah.
is just, let's say, under the umbrella of uh, security-related activities. So AI is used across, and they have been actually from a pure machine learning side of things,
Mm-hmm.
credit risk analysis, looking for fraud analysis in real time, surveillance of systems within the technology across the board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. That's a pretty broad question, but I feel like that's a good way to answer it. There's a lot of different ways that it can be used. Fraud detection is just one of the many ways. I mean, technically, surveilling a bank account, looking for fraud with machine learning. I mean, there's all sorts of examples. This one time I was pre ordering an iPhone, and you can imagine how stressful that is. I mean, trying to get it on launch day. And imagine my surprise when Apple Pay doesn't go through because my bank account thinks this is a fraudulent transaction. So yeah, machine learning can definitely help
Oh,
out here.
okay. Illustrated.
So yeah, that's how machine learning can be used in banking and surveillance. Next up, we got another question. Why is Google's April 2019 prank communicating with planks just a prank? Communicating with plants just a prank. Is there a way we can make it possible through AI to communicate with plants and trees and things like this? So I do want to get your thoughts on this, but I feel like it's something that can be done. I don't see why not. It just depends on your definition of communication. Obviously not communication as in how the two of us are interacting right now, but communication in the sense that you're monitoring all these different environmental and factors of the plant itself and then trying to classify, hey, does this plant need a certain kind of resource, yes or no, or these sorts of things. In that sense, yes, because that's just pattern recognition. At the end of the day, AI can do that. But then I'm not I'm not too sure about giving plants a voice exactly. That I think that was actually Google's 2019 April Fools, literally a video of giving plants a voice. So I don't think we're going to get to that point just because of the fact that it again isn't really a question that makes that much sense to ask. But what do you think about that?
I don't know whether the person is actually being serious, but I'm going to give the credit that the person is.
I have
But
a
I think
feeling they
this
are.
is also really, if it is, I think I think this is where it goes back to your original question, though, then when we started this chat, which is about expectations of AI and what we think is can be done in the context of Hollywood and everything else that goes with AI.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure AI will help us communicate with plants right now,
Mm-hmm.
not because AI can't, but because plants can't.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, plants don't have that ability. That's why it isn't really a question that makes sense to ask because there is no provision for that within plants. So yeah, that pretty much mirrors what I was thinking there. We do have another question, and that is AI. Can artificial intelligence help farmers to tackle climate change, which is affecting them very much? What are your thoughts on that?
This is such a good question, in so many ways, right?
Hmm.
So IBM's been doing a lot of work with this in this particular space, as you can imagine, and especially after we acquired the weather company,
Hmm.
to get access to the data, to be able to do some really micro area modeling on it. So
Hmm.
whether we are using the answer is yes at every step of that discussion, be it predicting the weather, be it predicting crop impact of weather, modeling crops on weather, communicating with farmers as to what they should or shouldn't do because of predicted weather patterns and how it will impact the crops, across the board. And then, of course, downstream, that's where there's a blockchain discussion that happens after that, from a supply chain perspective. But it is a good question, and the answer is a big yes.
Definitely. That makes sense. And yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways that artificial intelligence can and already is actually helping farmers tackle all sorts of issues, not even just climate change. I mean, you mentioned IBM has large investments in this area, especially with the acquisition of the weather company. And I mean, just even off the top of my head, right? Let's just take a look at climate change, right? So if you take a look, Google has this machine learning that they've used in their data centers to predict where they need to direct airflow so that they can use less cooling, but at the same time get a more efficient data center. And so that's one example of climate change. And what I love about AI technology is that an application in one area can be applied to a completely different area, right? So
Yeah.
UNet, for example, is a segmentation architecture built for neural networks that was originally for the medical domain, and now people are using it in every domain. They're using it from gaming to, of course, healthcare, which is where it started, to entertainment, to education. They're using it everywhere because it's such a general purpose architecture. So concepts similar to the ones applied with Google predicting where airflow needs to go could be used for farmers to predict where resources need to go for certain plants, when
Yeah.
plants should be harvested to ensure optimal harvest, or when to plant certain plants, or when to do this based off of predictions of the weather. Even though it's so chaotic with machine learning, we can do it in a more accurate way than possible before. So yeah, there's all sorts of ways that AI is going to be impacting, helping out farmers, and I can't wait to see the impact that the technology has on that. Next up, we also have a question: do you really need to understand concepts like mathematical, concepts like linear regression before you enter into AI or artificial intelligence? And really quickly, I think that the answer is yes and no, and it depends on how you want to learn, what your end goal is, why you're learning. It depends on a lot of different factors. If you're a developer and you don't really care about AI, but you just want to implement speech to text into your apps, there's no need to implement it from scratch. Just use the Watson API and you're good to go. But if you are a developer at a large bank or a telecommunications company, and you have to invent a brand new architecture to do fraud detection or to do voice recognition or something of that sort, even then there are already frameworks that exist. But at that point, it does become more useful to understand these concepts, because then you can go ahead and invent new solutions. So I want to expand this. I've kind of answered it for artificial intelligence, but for other emerging technologies, how important is it usually to understand the basic mathematical and conceptual sort of fundamentals?
Look, I think we kind of touched on this earlier, and the answer is similar, right? So it depends on how emerging it is. So
Mm-hmm.
if you ask me this question in 2014, um, you know, well, 2013 we really had a Jeopardy playing machine, and that you really needed to know what's happening there to be able to take that to a bank and have the conversation. But today it is just so accessible, and there's just so many different kinds of roles available in industry, where there are use cases where you don't ever need to know any tech, and you just spend your life figuring out the language to be used. So there are
Yeah.
people who are writers, for AI today. And I reckon this is what going to happen to any tech that goes past the emerging phase and into, let's say, a more constant growth phase.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be new roles that come out that does not have to be about the tech.
Mm-hmm.
But today, from an AI perspective, if you know the tech, there are jobs for you. If you don't know the tech and you want to focus on the user experience, there are jobs for you. If you are just a developer, as Tanmay was talking about, where you don't need to know how it does at the back, you just need to know how to call it, there are jobs for you.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Um, there is a really interesting question. I like this one. Thank you very much, Levy, actually, for asking all these questions. You're here asking a bunch of questions, and they're all pretty like really high value. And it is, what are some features missing in our current languages that will be necessary for emerging technologies? So programming languages, features that are missing. I would say that a pretty large amount of these issues are actually going to be solved by a single project, and it's called the MLIR project. MLIR either is an acronym or used to be an acronym for multi level intermediate representation. And essentially, MLIR is now part of the LLVM Foundation. So, really quickly, of course, if you program in, like, say, the C programming language, then of course you know C gets converted to assembly, which is then run on your CPU or other processing units. We'll talk about that in a second. And the thing is, with special kinds of compilers, like for example the LLVM compiler, what actually happens, your C code is converted to this really low level, kind of like assembly, but at the same time typed representation of your code, an intermediate representation that's generic across architectures and platforms, but is still very low level. Then that is optimized, so that's transformed to make it faster, then converted to assembly and then run. So for example, the Swift language, unlike C, actually goes from Swift to Swift intermediate language, then to LLVM, and then to assembly. And in each stage, there are platform specific optimizations that are run to get your code to run as fast as possible. Now, what the MLIR framework does, and this is super fascinating, what it does is it essentially makes it so that, for example, intermediate languages like Swift intermediate language can be represented as an MLIR dialect. And because it's represented as a dialect, that means other languages like Julia or Kotlin or Ada or Fortran or whatever can all benefit from the Swift Intermediate Languages optimizations. So you can reuse code and transformations and things like this across all sorts of languages. What that also means is that TensorFlow graphs can be represented as an MLIR dialect. And what that means is that Python TensorFlow, Swift for TensorFlow, and all these other TensorFlows can all use the same basic backend, this MLIR dialect. And what that means is that all of these different languages and all these different frameworks, they can all compile down to the same essential representation so that they can all run on essentially all the different hardware we have for AI, whether that's Grok AI inference chips, NVIDIA GPUs, Google TPUs, whatever it is. Because it's an MLIR dialect, it works across platforms. So I feel like that one technology is instantly going to solve all sorts of issues. And not just AI, it's going to solve issues for all sorts of emerging technologies, because it's going to enable languages to be generic across not just CPU architectures and operating systems, but even accelerators now, and even the algorithms and the frameworks used to program on those accelerators. So MLIR, I think, is really going to change the way compilers help programmers and enable a whole new dimension of interaction on that level. Dave, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you. I think you answered that question way at a completely different level than the person who asked that question expected. So thank you for that. I think where the interesting part to that would be the extension is the skills and the skills acquisition, and whether it changes how people learn their language skills. Because now what means optimal in one language need not be optimal in that language anymore, because the restrictions are
Mm-hmm.
changing.
Yes, absolutely. So from here, Okay, so there is another question. We've already touched upon this. Again, quick recap for this. Where to start learning AI, machine learning technology, if you're a total beginner. So, the main and new emerging programming languages. This is from Pearl. Pearl asked this question. Pearl, not Perl like the language. Pearl.
Yes.
And so, where to start learning AI, machine learning? Again, I would say get your computational thinking foundation. Dave, as you mentioned, cognitiveclass.ai is a great resource for free courses. I've built a couple of courses on there as well, and I'm building more on the Swift for TensorFlow framework and more. And from there, once you have that computational thinking foundation that you learn through a variety of resources, could be cognitive class, could be really anything. It could be the books that I've written that you see over here, and then and then from there, really start to specialize in machine learning and AI technology. For example, my book Tanmay Teaches Julia, which is right over here, the red one. This book not only introduces you to the world of programming, but also from there introduces you to the world of machine learning and next generation technologies through examples like Google Deep Dream and also how gradient descent works. And this gives you a good sort of introduction to the world of next gen tech. So that's what I would recommend. What I will do is after this is done, this webinar will be available as a recording, and I can put links to cognitive class and the course that I've developed in the description of that video. It'll be on YouTube. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if it'll be on Facebook, but it will be on YouTube for sure. So that's the question from Pearl. Now from there we have another question, and this is really interesting. I want to get your thoughts on this first before I give my sort of usual answer to this question. What are the ethical issues and concerns on AI, and what are the solutions to overcome bias in AI? So there's two here. There's first of all ethical issues and concerns, and then there's how can we overcome bias in artificial intelligence.
Plenty is the first answer. What are the ethical issues? Um, there's a responsibility when we are working with AI that people who are working with it need to own, whether it is a matter of privacy and using customer data and following the right regulations around it, down through to what data is going in to train the models and what biases there are in the data, and then once it's done, let's say you got the right data and you've built the right models and you have trained it with the right unbiased data. um, Models degrade over time, situations change. Are you running your data, are you checking your models and the life cycle of the models on a regular basis? So it is the entire lifespan of every model that you have to consider ethical impact through the process. So answer is a big yes. It is important and we have to do that. um,
Mm-hmm.
the second part to that question is in regards to how do you monitor for that. IBM's done some we've done a lot of work in this particular space. So we open source something called the AI Fairness Toolkit, 360 Toolkit, I think it's called,
Mm-hmm.
about a year and a half ago now. We launched something called OpenScale, which so what's an open scale? The way it's built is you run your models and you look at the payloads that are going into the model and all the data that's going in. Is there any bias in that process? And then you run it at every level. So, for example, if it's an insurance model and it is denying or approving a claim, was there any bias in the data that caused that? So you're taking 1,500 different variables to come up with a final output, but they are generally confidence levels that they're based on. So I can look at every confidence level to understand why a particular answer came true. So,
Mm-hmm.
and you can do that same for non-Watson other models too. So you can look at the payloads going through all of them. So IBM's very aware of this, and there's a lot of work happening on this particular space.
Fascinating, right? And I think one more thing to keep in mind is that bias isn't just what we as humans think of as bias, right? It's not just bias against a specific gender or race or whatever. It's not that kind of bias. It's more of, hey, there happens to be more of this class in the training data than this other class, right? It could be a bias towards GE jet engines versus Rolls Royce jet engines to predict if a part's going to fail. It could be bias in any feature. It's just bias that's in the data. So it's a matter of cleansing that data and ensuring that you're making decisions in a fair way across domains, across use cases, not just when it comes to certain key features. So I feel like that's very important. We do have a comment. This isn't necessarily a question. This is more of a comment. People are talking about the BERT architecture in the chat. And it's a pretty interactive chat going on right now. So they're talking about the BERT neural network architecture. And someone mentions BERT is an AlexNet moment for natural language processing. And I would say I have to agree with that. How we're
All yours.
generalizing. Yeah, how we're
This
generalizing natural
conversation
language
is all
processing.
yours.
No, I mean there's this BERT this BERT architecture being able to apply the same sort of embedding space to a variety of different natural language processing tasks. I love that, and how it's so generic. That's quite enjoyable. We did already answer quite a few questions. We do have a fun question over here from Lavi again. How is Dave still awake? It's almost 2:30 a.m. in Sydney. Well, I'm not going
It
to keep you too
is.
longer. Just a few more questions, really quickly, because I feel like
And
these are.
honestly, it's not hard staying awake given the nature of this conversation.
Oh
So
yeah,
I'm already enjoying it and keep the questions coming.
thank you. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love this. As long as people keep sending in valuable questions, we're gonna be here. So just a few more questions really quickly, and that is, what is the future of AI in business data analytics? This question is from Abdul.
Well, AI in business data analytics is
Mm-hmm.
what most AI is today, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
at least the ones that I work on a day-to-day basis. So if you look at the wide spectrum, what Watson's used for, they're all about data being used. Now, one thing that we're careful about is when we think data, we think rows and columns
Mm-hmm.
mostly. It doesn't matter how big, doesn't matter how fast. It is
Tabular.
really rows and columns, and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that is in the machine learning spectrum
Mm-hmm.
where we just go big data, we optimize, we predict, we do probabilistic modeling. Where it got really interesting about 5 years ago is when we started doing unstructured data. And when I used to talk to people, and even 5 years ago, when we actually no 10 years ago, it got interesting with the unstructured data. With I think 5 years ago, when I used to go to an organization and say, guess what, I don't even know what you're using for in your analytics side of it, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure by the end of this conversation, you will discover at least five more sources. And people go, "What are you talking about?" And like, if you have a contact center today, and you're
Mm-hmm.
currently doing churn modeling and just
Mm-hmm.
to see which customer is going to likely to leave,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not looking at all those calls that you're recording for quality and training purposes, um, they're just sitting there. They are
Yeah.
just sitting. They are invaluable source of information.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what's changed in the last few years is move from structured data only to bringing in unstructured data into the AI side of business analysis. That's been a big
Yes.
move.
That's absolutely true. And there's another example that I was gonna share, although I kind of realized that unfortunately I can't just yet. But all
Welcome
I
to
can
my
say
world.
is, all I can say is, very soon you're going to be seeing a lot on social media. And I'll actually refer back to this webinar when it's eventually launched, around a product that previously would only understand structured data that we're now expanding to also understand unstructured data, for the sake of being able to leverage the terabytes, petabytes of unstructured information and feedback that we have stored on databases across the globe. So I think I think that was all. There's just one more question that I really that just came in. I feel is really interesting. Um, do you think there is a lot of useless AI research done? I'm not demotivating colleagues out there, is what this guy says, but do you think there's a lot of useless AI research and repeated projects? Again, I kind of have a thought to this, but I want to hear what you think first.
There may be a lot of repeated projects, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't think there is useless AI research. It's
Exactly.
generally in context and time that makes the difference.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and specifically, what I'm saying is, or what my point is that it's not necessarily that these AI projects are useless. I don't think they're useless at all, actually, but rather the fact that people are working in a very isolated manner, right? People will replicate work even within the same organization, even within IBM. There will be 11 teams working on the same thing, and then eventually people will be like, you know what? We need to bring all these teams together to merge into a single product, right? Watson's a perfect example of this. So yeah, even within a single organization, that is possible. And if there's a way for people to find out what is happening on, in some completely different business unit, what's happening, and sort of work with them, that's much more effective. Last thing, how is AI being used in augmented reality or virtual reality for analytics to do decision support and troubleshooting? So that's pretty touching upon a lot of things here. Artificial intelligence being used in augmented reality or virtual reality for analytics to do decision support and troubleshooting.
So I'll tell you a real story here.
Yes.
This was for a telco, going back maybe 4 years. So we were working on a data center where people had to go fix servers. And the use case was actually, even the Woodside use case kind of fits into some of that without the AR part of it, or the VR, whatever the AR or VR. But the discussion for that conversation was, if something needs to be fixed, can we use Watson to predict what needs to be fixed and what tools are required to fix it? But we also have AR to help the person look at what's being needs to be fixed visually. So
Mm-hmm.
step by step instructions on what needs to be fixed. So um, that particular project, we did a POC on it and didn't really go anywhere. But Woodside did a lot of that, where they started doing the um, when if somebody is in an oil rig and something bad happens, it was talking to Watson to get help to fix what needs to be
Mm-hmm.
fixed, or what doesn't really have to fix, what needs to be done at that particular time, right? So Watson would read prior documents, prior audit reports, machine documents to suggest to the person at the rig what needs to be done. So the answer is yes, there are use cases like that. There are plenty of other ones that bring in IoT technology also, that you have drones flying over things that needs to be fixed. And
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of really interesting questions. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them. But one thing I will say really quickly, just as a comment, Brandon says Swift for TensorFlow versus Julia versus Python is the future of deep learning programming language. Is that shift of throne possible? I say yes, because Python is completely interoperable with both Julia and Swift. You can call existing code from those languages. You can call those languages from Python, and at the same time, Google especially is investing heavily in using Swift. So, where Google invests to shift their frameworks over, people listen usually. It's going to take time, but it will happen. There's a lot of really interesting questions. We'll try to reply to as many as possible in the YouTube comments of the live chat after this. But thank you very, very much, Dave, from me and really, I'm sure, from the entire audience. This was really insightful. You are absolutely an inspiration. Thank you for staying up till 3 a.m. in Sydney and allowing us to learn so much from you. And you're really passionate about the work that you do, and it really shows. So thank you very much once again for being on the very first episode of Tech Live Skills with Tanmay. And one more thing that I would like to mention is thank you very much, everyone, for joining in today as the audience. And so every week on Sunday, we're going to have another special guest on Tech Live Skills with Tanmay to really derive inspiration and get their it really boiled down their years of wisdom to answer the questions that you want answered. And so if you have any suggestions or feedback, feel free to leave that in the comments or tweet to me or message me on social media. Or if there's a special guest that you want on the show, let me know and we'll try to get them on. And yeah, once again, thank you very much, Dave. I really appreciate it. And Dave, goodbye.
thanks, and
Thank you
bye.
very
By
much,
the
Dave.
way, I'll
Bye bye.